in favor of one side versus another one. Let's say a resolution like this House would legalize polygamy, right? Intuitively, it doesn't seem to you like it's very easy to win that speech, so the ball sort of starts out somewhere else. So in debate, because we recognize that rounds are always contentious and people always have both their personal biases and also societal biases, where the ball starts out needs to be taken into account in terms of your personal assessment. So you're looking at who did the most legwork in convincing you either way of what ended up happening. The second way of thinking about a round is based on how much space arguments take up, right? And this is when you start judging. You'll be looking at, so there are some points, like you'll be, at the end of the round, you'll be able to tell some teams won some points for you. You'll be able to know that like one argument was just more convincing to you than the other argument. So in a more sophisticated way of just thinking about ball movement, which gathers it holistically, you can also think of judging BP as which arguments were the most important, right? So you don't have to win every single argument to win a BP debate. You just need to win up the most important ones. So this diagram hopefully tells you that it's relative space. This will come in handy when you're debating as well, right? So if you're thinking about debating and you're saying, oh man, I'm really losing this argument, it doesn't really matter. It matters how you frame the round and how you tell the judges, this isn't the most important argument in the round. Pay attention to this argument, right? This is something we often tell whips to do, but it's actually really useful for like everyone else to do as well. During the round is to think about where should I be concentrating my time? So the most important arguments in abortion rounds, for instance, maybe you think the most important argument is the rights of the fetus or the rights of the woman or whatever. Concentrate your time there and tell the judges why those are the most important arguments, right? So that's in terms of conceptually, how do you think about rounds? But when you're judging BP, that's not very helpful. So I've come up with a couple of questions. These questions, you don't have to really, like, there's no hard and fast rule about judging BP, but these are just some groups of questions that I think will help you in guiding your judging experience, right? So your first question that you might ask yourself is which points were the most important? So that goes back to the diagram I just showed you guys. Which points were the most important is based on two sort of things. It's based on what the teams tell you in the round, right? So what your assessment is of what happens in the round. It's also based on common sense, right? So like if a lot of, like a team, like even if teams don't point out that this person is talking about nonsense for like 5 minutes, you can do that as a judge, right? You can sort of say to yourself, that didn't really make sense to me, that doesn't really, this team spent too much time talking about this one thing that seems very peripheral, right? The second more interesting question is sort of who made these important points, right? So once you figure out which were the questions that you had to win in order to win this debate or to do well in this debate, you might ask yourself who made those important questions, right? And here's what we're talking about when we're talking about depth, because once you identify who made those points, you're also going to be talking about who made those points in the best way, right? Who made those points deepest, and who do you give credit to? And when your judges tell you, you need to go deeper into this argument, here's why, because you need to be able to go deepest into those important arguments in order to win the round. When we talk about depth, we're talking about a couple of things. We're talking about, first of all, who gave the most complete account of the situation, right? So you're talking about things like, you have to, in your debate speeches, you have to give a setup for how the round works. You have to give a worldview about how we think the world works, how states engage with each other, how citizens engage with their states. You also have to be talking to about why this argument is true, right? So why this argument is true will be related to that worldview, but it will also be related to other factors, right? So you'll be talking about things like actors, right? So you'll be analyzing the actors that are involved in this situation. What are their interests? What are their motivations? What are their perceptions? How do they relate to each other? And what's their relationship between, say, citizen and state, right? So if you're looking for depth in, say, arguments about the round that we had on Thursday, about the relationship between doctors and children, right? If you were in opposition, or if you were on proposition and saying that doctors should always have the final say, you might be looking at the interests and the perceptions and motivations of various actors. You might be saying that the way that states normally are involved with their citizens is based on allowing them the greatest freedom and the greatest choice, right? But that sort of framework breaks down when you're talking about children who don't have the ability to conceptualize the good life or to derive the benefits from actualizing that good life, right? So absent giving them the choice to pursue their version of the good life, the state will always protect their basic ability to choose in the future. And that's why the state chooses life. That's why the state chooses life, because life is necessary for choice. That's why the state would override the wishes of parents. And you might go through analysis that way, right? So thinking about the actors, thinking about how they relate to people, analyzing the who in that situation is also really important in telling the judge why this argument is true. The second one you want to be talking to about, the second question you want to be talking to in terms of depth is telling the judge why these questions matter, right? BP is always framed in the construction of this house. So who is this house? If this house is a self-interested actor like the United States, you want to be like, you know, the United States should get involved in Iraq, right, and start bombing ISIS. If you are framing this as a self-interested debate, you want to be framing your arguments and telling your judge, you as a self-interested actor should care about bombing ISIS bases because it tangentially relates. It relates in a concrete manner to your national security, for instance, right, to your perception abroad. It relates to your concrete interests abroad, right? And that's one way you might approach how to tell the judges, this is why this argument matters. The other ways you might tell the judges argument matters is maybe this house isn't a self-interested actor. Maybe this house is just your average, reasonable voter, and you're telling them why they should care about this issue, because they're a moral actor, right? So you might be telling them, you're a moral actor and you believe in rights. This is why individual rights are important, right? So it's not just the fact that individuals have rights, but here are why rights are important, right? Because they allow people, because they're wrapped up in certain conceptions of the state, they're wrapped up in conceptions of what a liberal democracy does, right? And what a liberal democracy, helping people choose the good life, and to choose the good life, people need X, Y, and Z capabilities in order to actualize that, right? You might be talking about rights. You might be talking about utility, right? You as a moral actor care about the general well-being of society, and this creates the most well-being, right? Whatever moral framework you choose, or whatever framework you choose for how you want to convince this house that it's important, you want to be always making sure that that framework exists, right? So it's not just enough to assert that a harm exists, either a harm to an individual's rights or harm to individuals' well-being. You have to be able to tell the judges why that harm or why that right is the most important thing in the round. And that's where depth comes in, and that's where analysis comes in, and that's how you win the question of who made those points, right? That's how you get the credit for those points. Otherwise, like, your back half could come in and just take that analysis from you, right? In British parliamentary, the way we judge is not only looking at who made the points first, but who made the points best. So if your back half can do enough, if the back half has done enough, even if they're touching on the same points, if they've done enough of that depth and of that exploration, then they can take those points from you, right? So in terms of, it's not just making the right points, you have to make them well. So that's one of the also round level questions, right? We also think about engagement in British parliamentary debate. Otherwise, if debate didn't have engagement, it would just be a series of, it would just be called public speaking, right? Engagement is also important in terms of showing you who engaged with those tough questions. You can get credit for just tackling on those tough questions, right? So if you've identified for yourself what the most important questions in the round are, you want to be engaging with those points, right? Otherwise, you end up looking weak. You look like you don't have responses to those points. And when it comes down to the judges' evaluation of your teams, the judges are going to be like, well, they had a really good case, but they didn't have any engagement. They didn't have any refutation. The other side gets the point because those points are still standing, right? If you don't engage with those points, then the points that your opposition team has made are still valid and are still on the table and still get credit. They've just won those points automatically because you've conceded them, right? So in British parliamentary judging, you also want to be looking at which points are still on the table at the end of the round and which teams have been engaging with those points, right? So these are sort of like first level questions that should hopefully allow you to conceptualize, sort of have a rough idea of, was this a front half debate? So were the most important questions coming out of the front half? Was this maybe a back half debate? Was it like a long diagonal? So like it was the first proposition team and the second opposition team that had the most important points or whatever, right? It should hopefully allow you to sort out, give a rough depiction of how the debate has fallen, where the cards have fallen. And these questions will also help you in terms of individual team evaluations. When you're looking closer though, in terms of closer rounds, you want to be looking at questions about teams, right? So if it's a really close round and both teams have made really great points, you want to be examining their case lines in a whole as well. Were their cases consistent when were they complete, right? So if their arguments made internal contradictions that sort of undermined their own case, then their arguments get less credit in that respect, right? If their case line isn't complete, if they've made good points, but the conclusion of that point was actually taken up by their back half, or the conclusion of that point was taken by their front half, then it's not as complete of a case line. And you might not think that, like, you might not put them quite so high. You can also think about whether their engagement was strategic, right? So that goes back to who engaged with the most important points in terms of where did they spend their time? Did they attack the best points, right? Because you only have 7 minutes in British parliamentary in a full round. You want to be strategic with your time and using your time effectively, right? When you have very close calls, you want to be thinking about team cohesion. These are like very, very close calls though. So like usually things like team cohesion and role fulfillment won't come into a VP debate judging unless it's very, very close. So like team cohesion means are there identifiable themes that are picked up by both speakers on each side? Are speakers reinforcing what their partner said, right? So like you can't just give 2 really good independent speeches. It's stronger if your partner rebuilds what you've gone up and said, and it's stronger if you can identify these are the themes that this team has talked about. This team is team freedom. This team is like team free markets, for instance, right? Team cohesion will also be quite important in that respect. Looking at that, and role fulfillment is sort of like the very last question that you should be deciding this round on, because usually, hopefully, teams have said enough good things that role fulfillment doesn't matter. But like role fulfillment in terms of did they introduce new material in the whip? Should you be counting new material in the whip? The answer is no. By the way, always no, because it's just not fair to the other teams. Or did the Prime Minister outline all the important arguments that were necessary for their side, for their case, right? Because the role of the Prime Minister, for instance, has to be about setting up the entire debate. The debate has to be very clear what that debate is by the Prime Minister's speech, right? So this is what we mean by role fulfillment. If they haven't done that, that means that they've not only hurt themselves, but they've hurt the debate in some way, right? Because they've changed the rules. So the Prime Minister's hurt the debate, or the whip has hurt the debate, or cheated, or had made unclear extensions, or whatnot, right? That's just a brief overview. Obviously these questions are just a way to think about rounds. They're not sort of hard and fast rules. You don't have to ask them in a particular order, but you always want to be starting out at the higher level and working yourself down. That's sort of the way to conceptualize judging. Does anybody have questions? In that case, lunch is soon. I'm just going to go check outside. I'll be right back. Thanks, guys. On lunch. It's good. In that case, pizza's ready.
Thank you, Catherine.